We carry these memories not as burdens, but as stories that deserve to be heard.
Story time. The letter had been written in a slanting, uncertain hand, every loop of ink trembling just slightly as though the pen itself was shy. Amora Lewis could still remember the sound of her sister's breathing that afternoon, the rasping patience with which Talia formed each letter. It had taken nearly an hour to write 6 lines. Amora had watched her, trying not to interrupt, afraid even a whisper might scatter her concentration. When the pen finally dropped from Talia's fingers, she looked up, smiling through effort. "You can't lose this," she had said. "I won't," Amora promised. The words on that page became a pulse she would carry beneath her uniform years later. "Run for me. Be strong for me. Be brave, even when I can't." Amora hadn't always imagined herself in uniform. As a child, she liked to fix things. Radios, bicycles, the broken handle of their mother's kettle. Her father, a mechanic who rarely smiled, would hand her tools without comment and let her figure it out. When Talia was born with cerebral palsy, Amora was 12 and already tall for her age. She learned how to lift her sister gently, how to strap the braces to her legs without pinching the skin. Strength became something quiet and necessary. Years later, when recruiters visited her high school, she listened. The military offered travel, education, structure. But what caught her attention was a single sentence in the brochure: humanitarian assistance in global conflict zones. The idea that she could help rebuild rather than destroy settled deep inside her. Her mother cried the night she left for basic training. Talia handed her the folded letter, already yellowing from being read too often. "So you don't forget what you're made of," she whispered. Amora didn't. Boot camp burned away hesitation. She learned how to march until blisters turned to calluses, how to take orders from voices that shouted because shouting was easier than caring. She didn't mind. She didn't need to prove she was tough. She simply was. By the time she earned her sergeant stripes, her fellow soldiers had stopped testing her patience. They trusted her judgment in silence. Her assignment to a humanitarian unit in Afghanistan felt like a circle completing itself. Building clinics, securing safe routes for aid convoys, coordinating with local elders. It was still a war zone, but one threaded with fragile gestures of peace. She arrived in early spring, when the air carried both dust and the faint sweetness of blooming pomegranate trees. The base sat in a shallow valley surrounded by low hills that looked gold at dawn. The first morning, she stood outside her tent and watched the sunlight catch on coils of barbed wire, turning them momentarily beautiful. The villagers near their operating area, mostly farmers and small-time traders, had grown used to soldiers coming and going. Truss was a fragile bridge built plank by plank. A repaired well here, a reopened school there. Amora was good at this. She smiled easily but spoke carefully, never promising what she couldn't deliver. The children called her Morajan, a term of endearment that startled her the first time she heard it. It meant they had begun to believe her kindness wasn't temporary. Corporal Diaz, her medic and closest friend in the unit, teased her about it. "You've got fan clubs forming," he said, handing her a bottle of warm water. "I've got a lot of work forming," she answered. "Same thing, Sergeant." He was right, in a way. Her presence carried a quiet rhythm, something people leaned toward. Even Captain Holloway, who measured compassion by its impact on logistics, respected her efficiency. Each night, before lights out, Amora unfolded the letter. The creases were soft now, nearly translucent. She didn't need to read the words anymore. She knew them by the grain of the paper beneath her fingertips. Still, she traced each line, breathing slow until the camp noises faded. The coughs, the laughter, the engines rumbling somewhere beyond the wire. The letter wasn't superstition. It was proof that love could travel across continents and survive sand, sweat, and fay. Sometimes she wrote back to Talia but never sent the drafts. They filled a small notebook with unmailed pages, descriptions of the sky, the smell of diesel, the faces of children whose names she couldn't pronounce. She imagined someday reading them aloud, both of them older, sitting by a window where sunlight poured in like forgiveness. Then came the day the air shifted, the kind of heat that flattens sound, when even birds grow silent. Their unit had been assigned to escort a convoy carrying medical supplies to a remote village north of Kandahar. Intelligence briefings mentioned sporadic insurgent activity in the area, but no organized resistance. Amora reviewed the maps, checked the terrain photos, and felt a knot in her chest she couldn't name. They moved out at dawn, 4 armored vehicles, a dozen soldiers, 2 translators. Dust trailed behind them like smoke from an invisible fire. The road twisted through low ridges, past mud brick houses, and dry fields where children waved as they passed. Everything looked ordinary, which in Afghanistan often meant danger was hiding just out of sight. I remember watching her that morning. She had this way of scanning the horizon without moving her head, eyes narrowing just a bit, like she could smell trouble before the rest of us saw it. I was joking about the heat, saying I'd sell my soul for an air-conditioned truck, and she just smiled, half amusement, half distraction. That's how I knew she was thinking ahead. When the first blast hit, I was halfway through a sentence. The road jumped beneath us. Dust swallowed the sky. Somebody screamed over the comms, "IED, front vehicle down." The next few minutes blurred into light and sound, the way chaos always does. But I remember her voice, clear through the static. "Secure the civilians. Get the med kits." She wasn't panicking. She never did. Back in Amora's mind, time stretched into fragments. The smell of burnt rubber, the metallic taste of adrenaline, the cry of a child somewhere ahead. The villagers had scattered, but one small figure, maybe 6 years old, stood frozen near a collapsing wall, too close to the smoke. She didn't think. Training was supposed to make you act automatically, but what propelled her wasn't training. It was a memory of Talia's words, "Run for me." She sprinted, each step jarring the earth. The world narrowed to that single terrified face. Bullets sparked against stone. Someone shouted her name. She dropped to one knee beside the boy, felt his small hand clutch at her sleeve, lifted him into her arms. Pain came after, the sharp bloom in her shoulder, the heavy fall of breath. She didn't stop. She ran until someone dragged them both behind cover. Everything afterward blurred into hospital lights, the whine of helicopters, morphine dreams that folded one day into the next. But one thing remained clear, the letter, still in her pocket, sticky with her own blood yet unshredded. The medics tried to remove it, thinking it was trash. She gripped their wrist. "Don't," she said. They didn't. The house smelled of antiseptic and lavender. Talia had learned to measure time not by calendars, but by phone calls. Weeks had passed without one. She watched news reports with the volume low, reading the scrolling captions, pretending not to search for familiar names. When the doorbell rang that afternoon, she felt her stomach folding on itself. It wasn't an officer with condolences. It was a courier, holding an envelope marked military correspondence. Inside was a short note. Amara had been injured but was stable, recovering. Talia pressed the paper to her lips and whispered, "You kept running. Hospital rooms are strange battlegrounds. The fight becomes inward, against pain, against stillness." She hated the stillness most. Her right arm lay in a sling. Physical therapy was a slow cruelty, but she learned patience again. She watched the light move across the floor each day, a reminder that healing was its own kind of discipline. Visitors came and went. Diaz brought coffee and sarcasm. Captain Holloway brought commendations she didn't want. Reporters wrote about heroic actions under fire. She ignored them all. The real story, the one that mattered, was folded beside her bed in a frame she'd requested from the nurses. The letter, clean, dried, the ink faint but legible. She would return it soon. When Talia arrived months later, rolling her chair down the corridor with cautious determination, Amara almost didn't recognize her. The years apart had changed them both. For a moment they just looked at each other, two halves of a promise kept alive. Then Amara reached out with her good arm and pulled her close. Neither spoke. The silence said everything. The distance survived, the fear endured, the love that refused to break. Finally, Amara lifted the framed letter and placed it in Talia's lap. "You were my strength," she said, voice trembling. That letter saved 2 lives. After discharge, Amara chose not to return to active duty. Instead, she began speaking to schools and community centers, her arms still stiff but her voice steady. She talked about courage, how it wasn't the noise of battle, but the quiet choices people make when no one's watching. Sometimes Talia joined her, reading aloud from her own journal entries about living with limitations, about watching her sister cross oceans for a promise written on paper. At one event, a young woman asked, "Were you ever afraid?" Amara smiled. "Always. But fear doesn't mean you stop. It means you keep going the way someone once asked you to." He would remember the smell of smoke, the sound of a woman's heartbeat against his ear as she ran. Years later, when he studied medicine at a rebuilt clinic funded by the same aid group, he kept a small photo clipped to his notebook, a soldier with calm eyes and a faint smile. He told his students, "Kindness can move faster than bullets." At dawn, she often sits by the window, watching the world wake in soft increments. Her shoulder aches in the cold, a quiet reminder of all the places she's been. On the sill rests a framed letter, creased, fragile, eternal. She traces it once more, lips moving with the words she knows by heart. "Run for me. Be strong for me. Be brave, even when I can't." Outside, children run down the street, their laughter bright as morning. She smiles, feeling the old rhythm in her blood. The war ended long ago, but some promises keep running forever. The flight back to Kabul was quiet, except for the drone of the engines and the occasional rattle when the plane crossed warm air currents. Amara had thought she was finished with Afghanistan. Yet here she was again, months later, no longer in uniform but in the khaki of civilian liaison. Her shoulders still ached from old scar tissue, but movement had returned. The Army called it limited duty, though she thought of it as unfinished business. She watched in the window as the mountains rose, vast, folded slabs of ochre and shadow. The same mountains she'd once seen through dust and adrenaline. This time there was only stillness. When the plane touched down, heat poured through the open hatch. The smell, diesel, spice, and the faint tang of metal struck her like memory. Diaz met her on the tarmac, his hair longer, his uniform newer. "Couldn't stay away, huh?" She smiled. "Somebody's got to make sure you're still doing things by the book." He laughed. "Books burned years ago, Sergeant." He still called her that. She didn't correct him. Her new assignment was deceptively simple: help coordinate the reconstruction of rural clinics destroyed during the fighting. But logistics in Afghanistan were never simple. Every plan had a thread through layers of politics, tribal agreements, and unspoken fears. The unit she worked with now was half military, half civilian. Engineers, medics, translators, each trying to keep hope from collapsing under bureaucracy. One translator, a woman named Layla, impressed her immediately. Barely 25, with steady eyes and a scar along her temple. She spoke 5 languages and navigated local elders with quiet diplomacy. "You listen first," Layla said during their first meeting. "If you speak too soon, they'll stop hearing you." Amara recognized a kindred calm in her. She took notes, not on paper, but in posture, tone, patience. By late summer, they'd reached the same region where the ambush had happened. The road was still pitted with old blast marks, but someone had painted white stones along its edge to mark it safe. Children played there again, kicking a plastic bottle as a ball. One afternoon, as they unloaded supplies near the village well, a boy approached her holding a small bouquet of dried wildflowers. He hesitated, then offered them. "For brave lady," he said in halting English. Amara knelt to accept them. The boy's face tugged at a corner of memory. The same eyes, the same solemn gaze. Could it be? "What's your name?" she asked. "Rahim," he answered. Her breath caught. She remembered shouting that name through smoke years before. It was him, the child she had carried. He didn't recognize her. Maybe it was better that way. She smiled and said, "Thank you, Rahim. These are perfect." When he ran off, she found her hands trembling slightly. Diaz noticed. "You okay?" "Yeah," she whispered. Just ghosts shaking hands with the living. That evening, she sat outside the compound watching the sun drop behind the hills. Layla joined her, setting down 2 tin mugs of tea. "You look far away today," Layla said. "Just thinking about how circles close when we least expect it." Layla smiled. "In my language we say, the past walks faster than the future." Maybe that's why it keeps catching up. They drank in silence. Around them the night hummed with crickets and distant generators. For the first time since her injury, Amara felt the tightness in her chest ease. She realized she'd been holding her breath for months. Talia's world unfolded in smaller radiuses, rooms, corridors, screens. Yet through those screens she watched her sister's face appear in grainy video calls. The connection lagged, voices stretching and snapping, but it was enough. "You look tired," she told Amara one night. "Good tired," Amara replied. "The kind that comes from doing something real." Talia smiled. She had begun volunteering at a rehabilitation center, helping children learn to use assistive devices. Her own chair squeaked on its left wheel, but she refused to replace it. "Every sound reminds me I'm moving," she'd say. She kept the framed letter by her bedside still, though the glass was cracked from an accidental drop. Sometimes she touched it and imagined the desert wind sweeping over it, connecting them invisibly across continents. Weeks turned into months. The project advanced. Foundations poured, walls rising like slow prayers. But progress had a price. Rumors of renewed insurgent movement began circulating. Convoys started traveling with heavier escorts. Amara listened to radio chatter at night, sensing the tension creeping back. One morning, a convoy ahead of theirs hit another roadside bomb. No fatalities, but enough to jolt everyone back into old caution. Layla approached her after the briefing. "Do you ever stop being afraid?" Amara thought for a long time. "No, you just learn to walk beside it." Later, in her tent, she unfolded one of her unsent letters to Talia and added a new line. "Fear is not the enemy. Forgetting why we're here is." The next day, they received word that the northern supply route was blocked by flooding. Their team volunteered to deliver medical packs through a shorter mountain path. It was dangerous, barely cleared, but they were confident. The convoy consisted of 2 trucks and a single Humvee for security. Amara rode in the back seat, watching the terrain twist into gorges painted in sunlight. Halfway through the pass, radio contact with base crackled and died. The driver cursed softly. Then came the sound, an echo that didn't belong to wind. A single distant crack. The truck ahead jerked sideways. "Sniper!" someone shouted. They reversed instinctively, tires skidding on gravel. Amara felt the old calm settle over her. "Smoke cover." "Left ridge," she ordered, even though she wore no rank now. Training overruled titles. The brief exchange ended quickly. One warning burst from their side, then silence. When the dust cleared, the hillside was empty. No casualties. Still, the reminder was sharp. Peace remained a brittle illusion. That evening she sat alone by the campfire, wrapping her hands around a mug for warmth. The stars above the valley looked impossibly close, like 1,000 small eyes refusing to blink. She thought about how strange it was, the coexistence of such beauty and such fragility. When Layla joined her, she said softly, "You see why people stay even when they could leave." Layla nodded. "Because the sky keeps forgiving us." She never talked much about that first ambush, even when she should have. I think the letter did the talking for her. I once asked what was in it, but she only smiled and said, "Everything that keeps me from breaking." That's Amara, holding worlds in silence. One night, after the sniper scare, I found her writing again. I asked, "Still not mailing those?" "Some words are meant to stay here," she said, tapping her chest. I remember thinking, people like her keep the rest of us human. The air that morning was still, heavy with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. We were preparing to move again when Rahim ran into camp, breathless. "Teacher, come. My mother, she is sick," he cried. Amara didn't hesitate. We followed him to a small house on the village edge. The woman lay feverish, her breathing shallow. Amara knelt beside her, checked her pulse, whispered something to Diaz. For hours they worked, cooling her with wet cloths, administering antibiotics, monitoring vitals. When at last the fever broke, Rahim burst into tears of relief. Amara sat back against the wall, sweat and dust streaking her face. She looked at me and smiled faintly. "Sometimes saving one person feels heavier than saving 100, she said. "But it's the right kind of weight. I didn't answer. I was watching how the boy clung to her sleeve, the same sleeve that still bore a faint bloodstain from years before. Rain finally came after midnight. The desert smelled of stone and renewal. She lay awake, listening to it strike the tent canvas. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry, quietly, without reason, without shame. The tears weren't grief. They were release. She realized she'd been carrying too many unspoken things. Guilt for surviving, pride disguised as strength, the ache of always being a protector. She whispered to the dark, "I'm still running, Talia." Outside, the rain answered in soft applause. She dreamed of running, something she hadn't done since childhood. In the dream, she and Amara were side by side, barefoot through shallow water, laughing. When she woke, the dream clung like mist. She looked toward the window and saw rain tracing slow paths down the glass. Somehow, she knew her sister was watching the same storm an ocean away. The morning orders arrived, folded in an official envelope. The paper thin and impersonal. Project suspended. All personnel to redeploy within 48 hours. The words felt like an erasure. Months of rebuilding. Relationships carefully grown from mistrust of fragile faith. Gone with a few sentences typed in another country. Amara read it twice, then looked across the courtyard where villagers were already working, unaware that the help they had waited for was being recalled. She felt an old heat rise in her chest. Not anger, exactly, but a helplessness she had thought she'd learned to tame. Diaz found her standing by the half-built clinic wall, the wind lifting strands of her hair. "Orders are orders," he said gently. "They always are," she answered. "Doesn't make them right." He didn't argue. He just stood beside her, watching the workers laugh as they hauled bricks. The sound heartbreakingly ordinary. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her tent was packed, the cot bare, the air thick with unspoken goodbyes. She reached for her notebook, the one full of letters never sent, and began a new page. "Dear Talia, tomorrow we leave. I should be relieved. But instead I feel like I'm abandoning people halfway across a bridge I promised to finish. Maybe bravery isn't just running into danger. Maybe it's staying when everyone else moves on." She paused, staring at the ink pooling in the dim light. Then she added, "If I can do one last thing here, just one, maybe it will be enough." She closed the notebook. Decision settled over her like gravity. At dawn, she wanted to find Layla. "We can't leave the clinic like this," Amara said. "The roof isn't sealed. If the rains come again, all the medicine will be ruined." Layla frowned. "We have no authorization. The convoy leaves tomorrow." "I'm not asking for permission," Amara said. "I'm asking for help." Layla looked at her a long moment, then nodded. "We'll need volunteers." By midday, a handful of villagers had joined them, Rahim among them, taller now, shoulders thin but determined. They worked under the punishing sun, hauling beams, mixing concrete, laying the final panels. Sweat stung Amara's healing shoulder, but she didn't stop. The rhythm of labor became prayer. Each hammer strike an act of defiance against abandonment. When the last piece was set, she climbed onto the roof to secure the tarpaulin. The horizon shimmered, mountains hazy with heat. Diaz called up, "You're going to make us late for our flight." She grinned down at him. "Tell the plane to wait. We're finishing this." Layla laughed softly, shaking her head. "She's unstoppable," she said in Dari to a nearby elder. The man replied, "Some spirits were born to rebuild." By evening, the clinic stood whole. It wasn't beautiful, but it was solid. Amara ran her palm along the rough wall, feeling the grit embed in her skin. "Now it'll stand a season," she murmured. "Maybe more." After the soldiers left, the village felt hollow, like breath drawn in but never released. But the clinic remained, white against the brown hills, a promise made tangible. People began calling it Dari Omid, the door of hope. Children played in its shadow. And whenever the wind blew across its roof, it carried the faint metallic rattle of the nails Sergeant Amara had driven with her own hands. Mail came unexpectedly, a small package wrapped in military paper. Inside, a folded cloth covered something rigid. Talia peeled it back to find a photograph. Amara standing before a plain building with a blue door, dust swirling around her boots. On the back, scrawled in familiar handwriting, "Finish what we started. Coming home soon." Talia traced the words. She imagined the weight of that dust, the heat on her sister's face. For the first time since the injury, she let herself believe the story might be turning toward peace. Departure day arrived muted, as if even the sky disapproved. Trucks idled, soldiers loading crates, paperwork fluttering. Amara walked the village one last time. The markets were open. The air smelled of bread and smoke. Raheem spotted her and ran over, holding a piece of paper torn from a school notebook. He had drawn a crude picture, a tall figure with a sling and a smaller one holding her hand. Beneath it he'd written, in shaky English, "Thank you for run for me." Her throat tightened. She crouched and pressed the drawing to her chest. "I'll keep it safe," she said. The convoy rolled out at noon. As they passed the clinic, villagers lined the road, waving. Layla stood among them, scarf snapping in the wind. Amara lifted her hand in silent farewell. The mountains rose ahead, vast and indifferent, yet she felt something inside her settle, like a knot finally loosening. On the long drive back to the airfield, Diaz leaned back and closed his eyes. "You think we'll ever come back?" Amara looked out at the endless desert. "Maybe not us," she said, "but something we built will." The airport smelled of coffee and disinfectant. Talia waited near the arrival's gate, chair angled for the best view. When Amara appeared, dressed in plain clothes, carrying only a single duffel, Talia wheeled forward before she could stop herself. Their hug was awkward, full of laughter and tears. "Welcome home," Talia whispered. "Feels strange," Amara said, pulling back to study her sister's face. "Everything's so quiet." "Quiet is good," Talia replied. "Quiet means you can hear your own heartbeat again." At home, life resumed its slower rhythm. Amara cooked, fixed things around the house, attended therapy sessions. Yet at night, she sometimes woke with the phantom echo of helicopters. Talia learned to leave a light on in the hallway. It seemed to soften the edges of the dreams. They spent hours talking about the clinic, about Layla and Raheem, about fear and forgiveness. Talia said, "You always think you're the strong one, but strength changes shape. You ran for me. Maybe now is my turn to stand for you." Amara smiled. "Deal." Sergeant, asterisk the clinics, still standing. Locals turned it into a training center for nurses. Layla's running the place now. She named one of the wards after you, Ward A. Lewis. You'd hate the attention, but I thought you should know. Diaz. She read it twice, then tucked into the same frame as Talia's original letter. 2 pieces of paper, both written in shaky handwriting, both testaments to the quiet endurance of connection. Rain hammered the clinic roof, but it held firm. Inside, Raheem, now an apprentice medic, organized supplies. Layla looked at the blue door and thought of the woman who had refused to leave before the roof was finished. She whispered, "Still strong for us, even from far away?" The wind rattled the tarpaulin gently, like an answer. Spring returned with its soft insistence. The garden behind her mother's house bloomed again. She had begun teaching at a community center, helping veterans navigate life after service. One afternoon, a teenager approached her after class. "You were a soldier?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Were you scared?" "Every day." "So how'd you keep going?" She thought of her sister, of letters in deserts, of a boy's drawing carried across years. "Someone believed I could," she said. The boy nodded slowly, as though storing the answer for later. That night, she opened her notebook of unsent letters and began a new one. Not to Talia this time, but to whoever might someday need it. "Dear stranger, if you ever find yourself afraid, remember, courage isn't a roar. It's a small decision to care anyway. It's the hand that reaches out when the world burns. It's the letter you carry long after the paper fades." She closed the notebook. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to fold away. Some words were meant to travel. The year turned slowly. Winter passed, but the cold seemed reluctant to let go. Amara moved through days that felt gentler now, though every kindness carried an echo of the desert wind. Her shoulders still ached in rain, but she'd learned to read the ache as weather, not as pain. Some evenings she'd sit by the window with Talia, watching dusk settle on the street. Neighbors' lights blinked on one by one, like quiet stars coming closer to Earth. "You ever miss it?" Talia asked once. "The uniform? The purpose?" Amara thought for a while before answering. In a way, out there, every day mattered. Here, the world feels softer, but also smaller. "Maybe you just have to learn to see it," Talia said. "There's still something to fight for. It's just closer now." Amara smiled at her sister's certainty. She'd spent years learning how to protect others. Now she was learning how to live among them again. In the hills of Bamyan, the seasons wrote their own story across the land. Snow melted from the peaks, water tumbling down into the valleys like released memory. At the clinic, Layla walked the corridors, her shoes echoing softly. Patients came and went, mothers with infants, farmers with cuts, children with fevers. She had hung a framed photograph by the entrance, Amara and the villagers, grinning awkwardly under bright Afghan sun. Every day people passed beneath it, some stopping to read the inscription in Dari. Built by those who believed in tomorrow. Sometimes, when the wind was right, she imagined she could still hear the faint rhythm of hammering on the roof, a sound that had once meant salvation. In early spring, she began to run again. At first, just into the street, then farther, through parks still slick with dew, past the river trail where her breath made white ghosts in the morning air. Each stride carried its own memory. The letter folded close to her chest, the taste of dust, the cry of a boy who had once needed saving. Now the sound of her shoes on asphalt became its own prayer. "I'm still here. I'm still running." Talia sometimes joined her from the porch, timing her laps with a smile. "You're faster," she'd tease. "I'm lighter," Amara would say. I finally put the sand down. Months later, an invitation arrived, a military symposium asking her to speak about leadership and humanitarian service. She hesitated. Public speaking had never felt natural. She preferred action to applause. But Talia urged her. "You have stories people need to hear. Not about fighting, but about staying human." So she agreed. The auditorium was full of young cadets and veterans, their uniforms crisp, their faces expectant. When she stepped onto the stage, the microphone picked up the quiet tremor in her breath. "I'm not here to tell you how to be fearless," she began. "Fear is what keeps you alive. What matters is what you do with it." She told them about the villages, about Layla and Rahim, about the clinic that still stood. She described the letter from her sister, how its creased paper had become her compass. "When I ran into that firefight," she said softly, "it wasn't because I wasn't afraid. It was because someone who couldn't run told me to keep moving anyway." The room was silent. No applause yet, just stillness, the kind that follows truth before recognition. Then the clapping came, loud and sustained. Amara looked down, blinking back the tears that had waited a year to fall. After the speech, Talia found her sister backstage, hands shaking slightly. She reached out and took them. "You did it," Talia said. Amara laughed softly. "I just told our story. That's all courage ever is." They drove home in silence, the kind born of understanding rather than absence. At a stoplight, Talia turned to her. "Do you ever think about going back? Not for war, for the people?" "I do," Amara said. "But maybe helping here first is how I go back. Maybe every person I teach, every story I tell, carries a little of them forward." 2 years later, Rahim stood outside the clinic's blue door, now weathered and sun-bleached. He had grown taller, his face losing the softness of childhood. In his pocket, he kept a photograph of a woman he barely remembered except for the warmth of her arms around him and the echo of her promise. "You're safe now." When foreign visitors arrived, aid workers, journalists, he would tell them, this clinic was built by a soldier who believed in peace. They would smile politely, perhaps not grasping the depth of that contradiction. But he knew. He carried it like breath. The years continued to move quietly. Amara and Talia built a small foundation to support medical training in conflict zones. Each month they sent supplies, sometimes to Afghanistan, sometimes to other places where the world still cracked along old lines. Layla wrote often, her letters careful and formal at first, then warmer, threaded with shared jokes and small joys. One morning, a new envelope arrived bearing an unfamiliar hand. Inside was a photograph, a young man in a medic's uniform standing before the clinic. Rahim, the caption said, now a healer. Amara sat for a long time before showing Talia. Look, she whispered. He kept a promise for both of us. Talia studied the image and smiled. I think you both did. The sisters visited the sea for the first time together. The air smelled of salt and possibility. Waves rolled and withdrew like breathing. Amara walked to the edge of the surf, letting the water climb her ankles. Talia wheeled close enough to feel the spray on her face. Amara pulled the old letter from her pocket, the one she had carried through dust and fire. Its paper was thin now, the ink faded to sepia. She unfolded it one last time. Run for me. Be strong for me. Be brave, even when I can't. She read the words aloud over the sound of the ocean. Then, after a moment, she smiled and let the wind take it. The paper lifted, fluttered, and vanished into the horizon. Talia laughed through her tears. You just let my best work drift away. It's not gone, Amara said. It's everywhere now. In Afghanistan, the clinic still stood. Children ran along its walls, their voices bright. Inside, Rahim tended to a patient while Layla updated a ledger. On the desk sat a small radio, its signal faint but clear. A reporter's voice mentioned a foundation overseas. Two sisters funding education for women in conflict zones. The announcer mispronounced the name. Louis became Louise, but Layla smiled anyway. She looked up through the clinic window at the pale morning sky. I told you, she whispered to no one in particular. Some spirits were born to rebuild. That is the end of our story for today. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel.